My name's Kent. I work on product and design here at Retool. And my real focus is on enabling users to design and build quality software inside of the platform. Design is, of course, a very important part of that goal, and so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Today's session is going to be very hands-on. I'm going to be working through a design exercise live. I'm going to explain myself as I go, but there's lots to show. So if I go over anything too quickly, don't worry, we'll share a recording of the session afterwards. I'll have about 30 to 40 minutes of content, and we'll leave the remaining time for live questions at the end. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go. We have some folks online who can answer them, and I'll get to any remaining ones at the end. So for today's session, we're going to be working through a scenario that I see a lot of people get stuck on. And the scenario here is that we have a Figma mockup of an app, and we need to implement it inside of Retool. This can be challenging because Figma and Retool are, of course, different tools. They have different capabilities, and it's not always obvious how to translate between the two. I do a lot of this work, and I want to share how I think it can be done efficiently and with really good results. So this session is going to be helpful for Retool builders, but also for product designers, whose teams may use Retool and who want to get a better understanding of how Retool fits into the design and development process. The last thing I'll say is this is 100% live, and undoubtedly I'm going to make a few mistakes, but hopefully it's an accurate representation of what this process looks like in real life instead of a perfectly produced video. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And maybe Daniel, you can give me a thumbs up or something that I'm sharing the right screen. It looks like I am. We're going to move forward. Cool. So the exercise today is that we are going to build this tool, this mockup that we have in Figma, inside of Retool. And this is like a marketing campaign management tool. We have two pages, a home page where we see sort of an overview of our campaigns, and then a campaign detail page where we can see some metadata about the campaign and its performance. Also in Figma, we have this sort of lightweight design system. It sort of identifies some of the design primitives that we're going to use in order to implement this inside of Retool. So this is what we're building, and by the end of the next 35 minutes or so, we'll have this thing built in Retool. I'm going to jump over to Retool, and really the starting point, I think, for any design exercise inside of Retool is with a theme. So I'm going to go over to Themes in Retool. We're going to Settings and Themes, and I'm going to create a new theme. We'll call this the demo theme for now, and I'll leave just all the basics up. And what we really want to do when we start is identify sort of the primitive design elements that we're maybe pulling in from our mockup or our design, and we want to bring those into the Retool theme so that we can reuse them as we're building, and we don't need to be thinking about color or typography as we're building. It's going to make for a much more consistent app. So in this case, in this mockup from Figma that I'm going to be using, I have that kind of pulled out already into this lightweight design system. So I could grab one of these colors, for example, this dark green, and I could add that as a user color inside of my theme. So maybe we name this dark green, and we paste in the hex value that I just copied. We're going to go through and do that for all of these colors. I used a color picking utility that I have on my machine to do that, but of course, if we're working from a design tool like Figma, we could be grabbing our values directly from the tool. So perhaps this is our light green token. And again, we can add that to our Retool theme, light green, and we can paste in our value. And then we'll be able to use this token as we're building. Now, even if I didn't have in Figma this sort of system to copy from, I would start with the same exercise. And I would do so just by looking at the screens I was going to be building. So, there's different colors here that I would just be grabbing from and pulling in initially. So you can do this, and I think I would recommend doing this, whether or not you're building from like a perfectly built up system where this is all defined for you, or if you're just looking at one screen you're implementing, you can still pull out those primitives and get them into your theme. Now, this system has about 10 colors I need to bring in. It wouldn't be unreasonable for me to manually sort of import all of those 10 by clicking and adding them here. But if you're building a more robust design or you're implementing your entire design system in Retool, it's going to get a little bit tedious to bring everything in. As an example, This is Retool's actual design system toolbox. This is what we use to build Retool. And these are all the colors and the shades of the colors that we would need to bring in if we wanted to implement this inside of Retool. And this is going to be crazy to bring in one by one. You wouldn't want to do that. There's a better way to do this actually, and that's using this Figma plugin that we built. It's the Retool theme generator. It's available as a Figma plugin. You can check it out now. But essentially what it does is it exports all your tokens or variables in Figma from a Figma variable collection and imports them into a Retool theme. So we can see how that works here. And for those who might not be familiar with this, essentially all of the variables that are inside this Figma file are stored in this local variable collection. It's kind of like a little database of colors inside of Figma. And so what our plugin does is it takes all of these local variables and it exports them in a way that can be ingested into Retool. So on this Figma file that has local variables set up, I can run our plugin and I can export these variables. I'm going to save this to my desktop. And then in Retool, in my theme, I can import a theme from JSON. I'll select that same file. It's going to replace the theme I've already done, which is fine. But we can see what this did is bring in all of the tokens from this system in Figma into Retool. So this is going to save a ton of time if you're bringing in a large system. Once we've brought in all of our variables, what we want to do is map these onto the styling properties that Retool exposes. And so if we look at our design, we can see, for example, that this green color, which is our dark green token, sort of seems like it's the primary brand color. It's used in this primary button, it's used in our logo. So we can map this token that we've added onto our primary variable that Retool exposes by selecting dark green here. And we want to go through each one of these and make sure it's set up as closely as possible to the design we're working from. So our background is fine, all our surfaces are fine, they're all white in our design, we can leave that. But our dark text, for example, the Retool default is that it's just black. We have a dark text variable that we imported from Figma that we'll choose. Same thing with border. By default, Retool's going to use this generated border. We have a border token that instead we can select. And so we'll use that to have more consistency with what we're pulling in from Figma. The last thing we'll do inside of Retool is get rid of all of these automatic colors. And these automatic colors are used in components like the tags component, or for example, in the table when it's displaying tags. And we want to make sure that these colors are matching our design as well. So we can add a few new automatic color tokens. They're actually already imported here in our theme as well. So we have this canvas one we'll grab. We have this lavender that we'll grab and add as an automatic color. Our cornflower. And lastly, this teal color. And we can see that once we've done this, even visually, our components inside of this Retool theme, they're starting to look a lot more similar to the design that we have inside of Figma here. And so this is a really helpful starting point. It's really well worth doing before you get started in order to maintain that consistency. But now that we've brought everything in and set this up, we can save this theme and we can go actually start building an app. So I'm going to go back home and I'm going to create a new app. I'm going to use a multi-page app for this exercise. I'm not going to go into detail here about sort of the pros and cons of multi-page. It's in beta right now. I think some of you probably have access to it. If you do have access to it, I'd recommend using it. It's sort of the future of sort of where Retool apps are going. And also if you do, if you're maybe a product designer coming into Retool for the first time and you're unfamiliar with single page apps in Retool, I think multi-page is going to feel a little bit more familiar. It's actually a little bit more similar to like a Figma file with multiple independent pages as well. So I would recommend using it if you have it right now. The first thing we're going to do in our app is apply our theme. So we're going to go to settings, we're going to go to app theme, and we're going to select that theme that we just created. And we can see that this theme has been applied because our canvas switched from the default gray background color to our theme white background color. The next thing we're going to do is set up our pages. So in our design, we have these two pages, the home page and the campaign detail page. So we'll change our default page here to be home, and we'll add another page, which is our detail page. And now we're ready to start building. So basically what I'm going to be doing is looking at our prototype and sort of pulling in the sort of best fit components that I think will be able to sort of reflect the design. And at the start, we're going to be painting with a pretty broad brush, just getting the stuff on the canvas and then refining as we go. So the first thing we see in our design is, of course, this navigation bar at the top. So in Retool, we'll go ahead and add a global component. It'll be the header. We have our nav items out of the box here. In our design, they're sort of over on the right, so we'll move them over to the right. We're going to get rid of this logo here, but we do, of course, need this logo. So we'll add an image component to the top. And what we can do, again, if we're working from a tool like Figma, if we have these assets available, we can export our logo frame here, save it to my desktop as well, and then inside of Retool, we can import this file. The layout of this is pretty wrong at the start. We're going to want to use cover, probably left align it, and make it much smaller. That looks like a reasonable starting point. Okay, over to our navigation items. Let's start by getting rid of these icons and setting the text. Our design doesn't have any icons, so we can just remove those. And we will make this campaigns. Customers, we will get rid of the icon and make segments. And settings can be settings, but we will lose the icon as well. We also, in our design, have this sort of green background on this item. I'm not going to go into detail here about sort of the construction of multi-page apps. We're really just focusing on the UI and implementing this UI. So for now, I'm just going to go to the campaigns item, and I'm going to hard code a highlight here. The last part we need up top is our little profile bubble. And probably the avatar component in Retool is going to be the place that we want to look to for that. By default, this avatar has a label, my name and email, so we can get rid of those because we don't have it in our design. And then this thing is going to be ready to pop up into our header. Now we're going to run into a pretty common problem in Retool, which is a problem of layout and spacing and sort of horizontal alignment. There's going to be no way using Retool's 12-column grid to get these two components properly spaced and aligned together. And so the general solution to this problem is to highlight both of our components and click Group, or you can go Command-G. And then once we've grouped it, and this group is really just a container component, an unstyled container component under the hood. Once we've grouped it, we can set its display property to stack. Stacks are new display types in Retool. They're kind of like Flexbox containers in CSS. So it's a stack, and now it's a stack. We have a lot more control over the width of the items within the stack. So we can sort of much more finely control the width of our navigation component. We can push it over to the right. For the avatar, we will set the width to be auto, which means it won't take up any more space than it needs to. And then for the whole section up here, we'll push this stack, we'll distribute it over to the right-hand side. So that's looking pretty good for our header. I'm going to ignore the image right now. That'll come sort of for free if we have SSO set up with profile pictures. But let's move on to the rest of this page. So we clearly need our campaign header. I'm going to grab a text component and pop that on at the start. And we'll say campaigns. You could always in Retool style text with Markdown. That's what I'm doing here. And sometimes it's a really efficient way to work. But what we're really doing when we're using Markdown is setting a font size and a font weight at the same time. And often, especially if we're implementing a design from Figma or something, we want to be independently controlling our font size and font weight. So we have a new font control style property on all the components, of course, including the text component that we can use here. So now this component is set to this body token. This is coming from our theme. All of these typography classes are in our theme. And what we want to do is we want to match it exactly to what we have in Figma. So these little things of sort of matching all of our type and everything is going to go a long way to making sure this design looks consistent. So in Figma, this piece of text is enter bold 36. So we could actually select enter, we could select bold, we could select 36, and we can control all of those things independently in this new font control. Enter bold 36 also happens to match to our heading class, so we can just choose that here, and that's what we need for campaigns. Next up is our button. So we'll grab a button component from Retool. And this is going to be green out of the box because of the theme we set up and that primary color we used. We will change the text here to create campaign. And we clearly need a little icon at the start, so we'll add a prefix icon and select our plus circle here. The next thing I'm seeing, if we compare this button to the one we have in Retool, is it's a little bit rounder than the one we have in Retool. So we can, of course, inspect that in Retool, or sorry, in Figma, see that it has a border radius of 8 pixels, and we can match that inside Retool with the border radius style property, set it to 8 pixels. The last thing about buttons in Retool is by default, they're going to take up sort of the full width of the bounding box that they're given. And while this looks fine, this button looks reasonable right here, if we were to make this window a lot bigger, the button grows. And certainly at widths like this starts to look a little bit silly. This button should really only ever be as wide as its content plus a little bit of padding. It doesn't need to be any wider than that. So in Retool, I like to, for my buttons, align them to one side of their box. And that means that it's going to maintain sort of a consistent size. It's not going to grow and shrink with the page. So you should do that here. And we can move on to these card containers below. They look like containers, so we can start with a Retool container. Visually, they're sort of just an outline here, so we don't need the header on the container. We can just get rid of that in Retool. And then if we think about the items that we have inside of these containers, it's really just 4 different pieces of text. So I can grab text from Retool and start to drop those into our card containers here. We'll set all this text up so that it matches our design. So up here we have click rate. Next up we have the 35%, then the plus 2%, and the since last month. What we want to do now that we have the content in here is, again, make sure that our typography matches our design. So we can open up our design. We can see that this component is inter semi-bold 12. We're going to go through and match that for all of these text components inside of Retool. So we'll add a font style property as well. Inter semi-bold 12 happens to map onto our label type class, so we can use that. 35% is interbold 28. So we will set that to be interbold 28 inside of Retool. I think that happens to be our heading 2. Our 2%, let's see here, is interbold 12. So in Retool, I think that's going to be our label emphasized type class, interbold 12. And finally, the since last month is just going to be regular font weight 12 size. So that's good out of the box. So we've set our type size, we've set our type weight. Now we want to look at colors. So this 2% is the green we can see from our design. And because we already imported all of our colors to the theme that we've applied to this app, we can consume that in the styling property for this component. So the color here, we can choose our dark green token. Actually, maybe that's our light green token. And for our since last month, it looks like a little bit of a lighter text. Let's have a look. It's our soft text token. Great, so this is looking good. Let's arrange these. And as we go to arrange these, we're going to run into the same problem that we dealt with in our header up here. Really, there's not going to be enough fidelity in this grid to sort of arrange these perfectly with one another. And so again, we're going to use the same solution, which is to select both components, Command G. Well, that might be a little bug. We're just going to keep moving on. We're going to stack them. And then once they're stacked, we're going to have a lot more control over the width of each thing inside the stack. So this component actually probably has a little bit too much margin on the right-hand side. Every component has margin control. We can sort of choose normal or none, or we can more finely grained modify it with this CSS syntax here. So this is saying the top margin is 4 pixels. We'll leave that the same. The right margin is 8 pixels. We're going to bring that down to 2. The bottom margin we'll keep as 4 pixels, and then the left margin we'll keep as the original 8 to maintain our sort of left alignment here. So now we should be able to get that even closer. And we'll do the same thing on the since last month. We'll modify that left margin a little bit, bring it down to 2. So that's looking better. If we compare with our design, probably the next thing catching our eye is the spacing. There's a little too much vertical space in Retool. So we will also modify the margin, the top and bottom margin on this text component here, and condense that a little bit. Our border on these boxes, it looks a little bit rounder in our Figma file, so let's inspect that as well. It'll be this frame, and it has 8 pixels of border radius, so we'll do that for our containers in Retool as well, and make that 8 pixels. Cool. This is looking pretty good. We will take advantage of this work we just did and copy and paste a few of these. There's 4 of them in our design. And we're not going to worry too much about sort of manually fiddling and aligning all of these things. Instead, we're going to group them, we're going to stack them, and then for each item in the stack, we're going to set its width to be fill. So if a bunch of items in a stack all have fill width, they'll distribute the space evenly, which is kind of the behavior that we see from our design here. They're distributed evenly. So we can do that. And then we can manipulate our stack kind of as a whole. We'll align it with our left side campaigns here and bring it in one as well, move our button over. Nice, this is looking pretty good. Okay, moving right along to charts. This chart, of course, this is built in Figma. It's not a real chart. Really, it's just like a collection of these individual items. We don't want to be constructing anything like that from scratch inside of Retool. So we will grab a chart component and see how close we can get. This isn't very close. It's a bar chart. We can swap it to a line chart. And although that's closer, this doesn't look great. Honestly, there's like too few points here, so the lines aren't very smooth, but then there are these like points on the line that we don't have in our design. So I actually have a tool that I built for this specific job, and it's a public Retool app, so anybody here could use it. But basically what it does is it generates fake data to use inside of charts. So for a real Retool app, we wouldn't have fake data populating our charts. But if we're just going through the design exercise of trying to visually match a prototype that we might have, a little tool like this helps a lot to get realistic looking data without having to worry about querying something or transforming data or doing anything like that. So in this little tool, we could grab our blue color and we could paste that into our chart. And it looks like we also want to have an X and Y axis and maybe a Y axis grid. And now we can copy the data from this chart and we can switch our chart in our Retool app to Plotly, paste that in, and do the same thing for layout and paste that in. And we get a chart out of the box in Retool that looks, frankly, a lot better, I think, than the standard chart. I'm not going to go through adding a second line to this chart. It could be done relatively easily. We just generate another color and another set of data. Really, what I would say about charts is they're just a wrapper on top of Plotly, and Plotly is a really quite expressive charting library. And ChatGPT is very good at generating and manipulating Plotly configurations. So I would recommend everybody asking ChatGPT, hey, I want to remove the y-axis on this chart. How do I do that? You can almost directly paste that into Retool all the time and get like a pretty good outcome. Again, as a design exercise, it's probably like a pretty good place to be starting with. So we have our chart on here. We, of course, need our trends title. We'll just copy the campaigns text element that we already had. And we will look in Figma and see what we're dealing with font-wise, interbold 20. So we can see we actually don't have interbold 20 as one of our existing type classes. So we'll unlink that from the token. And we'll say that our font size here is 20 pix. And that should look reasonable. We'll change this to trends. We'll need the same thing down below in our active campaigns section of our design. So we copied that label. We'll go active campaigns. And we need a table. So let's grab a table in Retool. And this table actually looks pretty close to our design out of the box, mostly because of the work we previously did setting up our theme and making sure that all of our automatic colors match. But we probably want the data in this table to better match the data inside of our mockup or our prototype. We could manually sort of copy and paste all of the sort of rows from this data and build it in Retool. But again, another tip when we're just sort of going through the design exercise of implementing something in Retool, if you want to get mock data, it's really handy to take a screenshot of something like this and then pop it into ChatGPT and ask it to generate a JSON array of the data. And then you can directly grab that JSON and paste it into a Retool component. And now we have the same data from our design inside of Retool. Next up with this table, the columns are pretty off. The width of the columns are pretty off. One solution to this is manually manipulating each column and sort of changing the width of it. But unfortunately, that's not going to be very dynamic to the page width. So even if we did that and it looks fine here, if this was to grow substantially, we'd have all this empty space. It's not going to look very good. The table gives us a way to do this out of the box if we go automatic column width on our table. With automatic column width, it's going to try to just sort of maximize the space available. It's not perfect, but it's usually a better starting point than manually manipulating table column widths. The other thing I see here is this reach column seems to be sort of oddly pushed to the right. I think that's probably because it was formatted as a number, and by default numbers are aligned to the right. We can just show it as a string here, which is going to move it over. Looks a little bit better. And because we have the automatic column width, as we grow this, our table is going to distribute its columns in a more sensible way. Okay, next up on the table is this green color. It's like indicating the selected row. The reason it's green is because the table uses the accent color from the theme by default. And if we look at our design, we don't really have any indication of what the selected row or the hover row state is. So I'm just going to get rid of that for now to get rid of this design, this green color, and clean up our design a little bit. So I can just set row selection to none for now. And while we're on the topic of colors, the header in our table needs to be modified. The header color is a style property we expose. So we can grab one of the tokens from our theme. I think it's actually the same as the border color, which is a bad token name, but you'll forgive me. And last up, our design doesn't have any of this footer stuff in the table. So we can again turn that off in the advanced settings of our table, deselecting show footer, and probably selecting auto height for our table so it only uses the space that it needs. And this is looking pretty good. For what it's worth, I just hit Command Option Enter, which jumps between this quick preview mode and the editor mode, handy to like quickly check if things are looking good for an end user. It's equivalent to clicking this button up here. And when I do this though, the one thing that's catching my eye is things are looking a little bit wide. Certainly, if our browser was wider, this is looking a bit crazy. It's way too wide. And by default, Retool apps use 100% of the browser width for the app width. There are trade-offs with any number that we would pick here. But in this case, and I think most of the time when we're copying a design from a design tool like Figma, there's sort of an implied max content width with this tool. And so we can do something similar in Retool by going to settings in general and setting a max canvas width and putting in something like 1260 pixels here, let's say. And then Retool is going to enforce this max width. It's going to center our content. And as our browser was to grow, it would maintain that size. It's also easier for design because you're designing for like a narrower scope. It doesn't need to look good at 2400 pixels wide and at 800 pixels wide. And it's harder to do that. All right, moving right along to our next page here. We're going to go in our pages setting to the detail page. And let's look at what we have. We get our header, and it's the same out of the box because it's a global component. We need this sort of like little back button on the campaign. You could do this with a text component. The link component is going to be a little bit better set up out of the box. So we'll add our title here, campaign. We need a arrow, so we'll add a prefix icon, search for left. That one looks good. The underline is not part of our design, so maybe we'll just say on hover, we'll do an underline, is fine. And lastly, the color, of course, needs to be changed to our soft text token. We can grab the same title text that we used in this page and pop it over here. And we will use summer product launch and make this a little bit wider. And next up is these tabs. This is kind of interesting. I want to spend a little bit of time on these tabs. So Retool has a tabbed container, of course, which is a preset of the container option. It comes out of the box. It looks like this, which is pretty different than our design. And honestly, I think it's pretty different than most of the tabs you'll see designed these days. So what I like to do here is grab and start with a tab container, but get rid of our tabs from the container itself. They're still going to be connected, so they're still going to function to sort of switch the view of this container, but we're going to separate them visually. We're going to switch the tabs from the pill variant to the line variant. And we're getting closer, but the spacing of our design is much different than this one. So we set it to a fixed height. We can increase the height a little bit, and that's going to grow the space between the label and the bar underneath. So that's looking better. While we're here, we can put the correct options in here. So this is overview, this is audience, and this is budget. And we just need to do some colors. So on the tabs component, we can say the selected text color uses our dark green token. Nice. As I said, this tabs is still connected to this container. In our design, there's no visual sort of parent container for all of this stuff. There's certainly an implied tabbed container here because as we switch tabs, we'd expect all of this stuff to switch. And so what we want to do is make this container really more of a functional container than a visual one. We're going to get rid of the border. We're going to get rid of the margin and padding so it doesn't modify the layout of the items within it. We're going to get rid of the header. So now this container exists mostly just as a functional container for us to put stuff inside of. We can copy the little cards that we used on our first page over here, and we will create a few of these, just copying and pasting, and then we can drag those into our container. And again, that's odd. Sometimes I have a weird combination of feature flags on this instance. So actually what I'm going to do is make this fixed height just to give us some room to work. And then it's going to be a little bit easier to drag all of these items into my tabbed container. And the last one, there we go. Now we can switch this back to auto height, so we just don't have to worry about it. This container over here is like a bit of a visual container. So we will start again with a Retool container. And we will probably get rid of our header because we don't have that in our design. And this is looking like a key value, probably is a reasonable starting point for this. And then let's focus on this button here. So our little edit button, we'll of course start with a button. We're going to switch this button to our outline variant. We need our pencil icon. So we'll add a prefix. We'll search for pencil. Actually, this one is going to be as close as we can get. So that's a trade-off we're going to have to make when we're trying to implement this design. And of course, this should say edit. The last thing we'll do is use our same sort of button alignment trick that we talked about. We'll align it to the right-hand side so it doesn't take up too much space. Okay, we have our 2 pages, I think, mostly built out. We went through our process here of starting with a design, grabbing all these primitive design elements, the colors in this case, importing them into a Retool theme, mapping them onto the theme style variables that Retool exposes, and then using that theme within an app and sort of customizing each of the individual elements within an app in order to best match our design. Whoops. Cool. So that is, we're at 33 minutes, right? Sort of on time as we expected. I'm going to talk about this. Forgive me. I have a screen sharing artifact that is affecting where I can click. So we're going to move that down. Talk about where these features are available right now. I imagine a lot of people want to probably use them. So the things we sort of showed in this and what enabled us to build this tool is really theming, stacks, multi-page, and component level typography. So theming is in private beta on cloud and the most recent stable release. As a quick reminder, private beta means that we have to turn the flag on for you. Public beta means that you can go to settings/beta of your Retool instance and turn it on yourself. Stacks are 100% available everywhere, so you can use that. Would highly recommend it. Multi-page is on public beta if you're on cloud, so you can turn it on. Private beta on-prem. And component level typography, private beta on cloud. It didn't make the stable release cut, so it'll be in the next one in December. I'm happy to turn on any of these flags for the folks here who want to do more with design in Retool, and would love any feedback you have as you are using them. So with that, I'm going to move over to some questions from the chat. I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a second. And let's have a look at our chats. Nice, we have some love for color slurp. That is the color picking utility I used. I agree, color slurp rocks. Yes, I could have just used the eyedropper tool in Figma. So Scott made a comment here about charts inside of Retool. I did kind of gloss over this, to be honest with you. And the reason I did that is actually because we are sort of totally refreshing the chart component, and it's going to start with way better presets out of the box. Right now, there's like the line and the pie and the bar chart. We're going to have presets for really any chart that you would need, much better realistic looking data. So you don't need to use, for example, that tool that I showed you that generated the fake data. So a lot of improvements made to charts. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on teaching people about the sort of finicky parts of Plotly here, because hopefully you won't have to do too much of that in the future. The shortcut to group components was, Command G, Control G if you're on Windows. Super helpful. Group your components and then stack them. It's going to be very, very useful as you're designing. Why didn't I use the statistics component for the click rate display? The honest answer to that question, and let me share my screen maybe while I answer this, because it's interesting. This screen share, cool. And I'll move this guy down. So if we look at our cards here, the question is, why don't we use the statistics component for this thing? And let's have a look at how that would have felt. Very reasonable starting point, I think, to use the statistics component for something like this. But the statistics component for the trend, here we have the like plus 8%. Our trend in our design is plus 2% down here. There's no way to configure the statistics component to move this below. And so this is kind of where we get into this interesting sort of trade-off space when we're designing in something like Figma and Retool. And I think if I was a product designer designing apps for sort of implementation inside of Retool, I would probably get pretty familiar with how the Retool components do it. And then if your designs reflect sort of the layout and structure of the Retool components, it's going to be easier to implement. But I also wanted to kind of recognize the reality that I think a lot of people are currently experiencing, which is that their designs did not perfectly sort of map onto every single Retool component. And sometimes you have to do stuff custom, and you have to kind of construct these components from the ground up. So that's sort of the trade-off I think about when I would look at implementing something like this and the default components that Retool gives you. We have a question here about the neatest way to make my app fit the screen height. I'm not sure if I understand exactly what that question is referring to. So if you want to add a clarification in the chat, please feel free to do so. But I will share maybe a few tricks around screen height. I'll add a blank page to demonstrate this on. One thing we can do inside of Retool is, let's say we have a container on this canvas. Each page has this property that's expand contents to fit. So basically it uses the full viewport height and width for this component. So this container component is now sort of expanded to the full height and width. It has a header. We don't want it, we'll get rid of the header. And now essentially this whole canvas is the container component. If we added, for example, something like a button, just to demonstrate, to this container, and then set this container to stack, the stack gives us probably better control over centering things both vertically and horizontally. And no matter how big this browser window is going to get, the stack will maintain the sort of centered position of this element inside of the container. So I don't know if that answered the question exactly, but in general, when I'm thinking about sort of managing my height, using expand contents to fit, which sort of will fill the available space, is probably a good starting point. And there's a question about the theme plugin working for the self-hosted instance of Retool. Yes, it absolutely does. Really, it's a Figma plugin, so it's sort of totally independent of Retool. If you have a variable collection inside of your Figma file, the theme plugin will work. You can use it, you can download the file. The place where you might run into trouble is if you're not using a new enough version of your on-prem or your self-hosted version of Retool, or if you don't have the feature flag set, which again, I'm happy to set for you, you will have the old theme experience in Retool. And so this Figma export exports a theme in a format that's appropriate to be imported into this sort of new theme experience. The new theme experience, which includes the tokens, includes all the component sort of specific level styling control. That is really what you need on a Retool way in order to take advantage of what you can export from Figma. Just looking through the rest of the questions. One of the questions is, where can we learn design tricks of Retool beside this info session? That's a great question. There's going to be a couple places. Of course, recording content like this and making it consistently available. It's going to be one thing that we're going to be continually doing. And so this will be on YouTube later, and hopefully we'll sort of build up that corpus of knowledge, which will be a good place to look. I should call out Retool University, which I think is going to be formally launching just next week. You can shoot me an email if you have questions about that. I'll find the exact date, or maybe we'll follow up in an email with when it's going to be launching. It has a course that I helped develop with our education team on best practices basically for designing in Retool, which goes into a lot of the same stuff. So if you want to learn more of the basics, probably at a better pace than this very fast presentation, the Retool University design course is going to be good for that. And then the last plug I'll make is this Retool Studio, which is a public Retool app, sort of a site that I own and maintain. And oftentimes when I'm building example apps, usually for webinars or dev days or something like this, I will post the app that I built here, which you can look at. So these are all Retool apps, no custom CSS or anything. These are all just Retool apps. And these are examples of some of the tools I've built in order to sort of push the limits of design in Retool and see what we can do. They're available on this public Retool app to check out. And you can also download the JSON of them as well. So this is a place that if you're interested in understanding some best practices, you could export one of these apps, download one of these apps and import it into your instance and have a look at what's going on under the hood. Question about font types. And yeah, certainly. So in our theme, in the new theming experience, we have a typography section. And Retool's two system fonts out of the box are Inter and JetBrains Mono. You can add any number of additional new fonts from Google here. So we can basically bring in as much of these as we want. And then we could even make, for example, this the default font for all of our components. These are a subset of Google fonts. We're working on adding all Google fonts. You can also import custom fonts. The way that the custom fonts works right now, I'm going to be honest with you, it's not the most ergonomic thing in the world. What you have to do is host your font file somewhere. You also have to host a CSS file with a font face rule somewhere referencing the font file that you've hosted in the first step. And then you can provide that CSS file as the import URL here. So this does work. We're working on a better system, which will use Retool storage actually, and just upload everything to the instance of Retool. It's part of the reason why all of this theming and font stuff isn't totally released yet, because this custom font experience is not great right now. But yes, you can add your custom fonts, and you can even say, for example, that for this particular type class, heading 6, you wanted to use this font family, and maybe for the body, you wanted to use this font family, which would be a crazy setup, but you can configure stuff like that. Okay, next questions. How can I log into Retool Studio? You can't log into Retool Studio. It's a sort of a private internal instance, but everything that you're intended to see on Retool Studio is a public app. And so if you go to Retool Studio/p/home, you'll be able to access it. And again, if you click on one of these links to go to one of these individual tools, they're all public links. So everything that's publicly available on Retool Studio should be accessible without a login. Somebody pasted my personal website, which is cool. I recommend you click on it. It's sort of a fun little physics thing, but we don't need to go through that much more. Okay, I'm not seeing too many more questions. To the Retool folks who are helping manage this, let me know if I've missed any. You can add it to our doc here, which I'm looking at. I'll do a little bit more scrolling. Actually, so Vrain asks an excellent question here, which is, where would you point a product designer who is designing natively for Retool with Retool's components? Is there a Figma file that provides all of the components? This is a really interesting question. And the short answer is that we don't provide this ourselves. We don't actually even have internally like a sort of perfectly productionized, ready for public use version of all of our components. We use Figma sort of as a tool, but the source of truth is code for us. And so we don't have this to expose. However, there are on the community other tools that you can use. There's this Retool UI kit, excuse me, from InfoBeams. I think maybe at this point it's a little bit out of date, but it's a decent starting point if you do want to use the Retool components within Figma. But what I would really say is I would encourage you as a product designer, if you're just designing for Retool, try to just use Retool. I think that can be a really valuable exercise. I think it can also save a ton of time because you don't have to do this sort of design in Figma where really we're just drawing pictures and then you need to go have somebody re-implement it in Retool. If you can just build the front end inside of Retool yourself, we don't need to sort of mess around with that translation layer. Somebody can hook up the data. That is, in my experience, kind of the optimal way that I've seen product designers get involved in this sort of Retool design and development lifecycle is actually just get into Retool, start building your own apps, ignore the parts of it that are maybe outside of your scope, like all of the data and writing all the JavaScript. Just focus on visually sort of arranging the components and let somebody else worry about hooking it up to real data. And if you specifically are a product designer and are having any questions or how to get comfortable with Retool, please feel free to drop me like a casual email anytime. I'm really happy to help with that. That's a sort of a core focus of mine. Oh, I'm just realizing as we look at this app that these things are not aligned, which we will not accept. Cool. Any questions? Any other questions? Are we able to switch themes with an event handler? So this is a great question. And this is one of the great features of the new theme experience. And so I didn't get into this at all, but I think it's important to show off. If we create a new theme, we can actually have any number of different theme modes. So you wouldn't be switching themes with an event handler, but your theme could have multiple modes. Light and dark is the obvious example. You could have a high contrast mode, or you could imagine having like different brand modes. There's a bunch of different use cases for this. We can create this theme. It's going to be the modes example. And inside of Retool, we have our default light mode, but we also have dark mode here. as like the default theme. And again, you can add your own themes, you can delete these ones, you can make any number of themes. And then now that this is set up as a theme, we could go back home and let's have a look at what this looks like applied to our app. So instead of the theme that we created at the start, we will select our modes theme. And then now we can set what our default theme is going to be. This looks obviously pretty bad. We would want to, in the charts background color, consume the theme canvas color here so that it doesn't look white. But otherwise, switching between light and dark mode, doesn't look crazy right now. So we can set our default mode inside of settings. And of course, you're going to also want to be able to allow a user to configure their mode, right? With like, imagine a light or dark mode switch or something. And you can do that with, for example, let's just do something really simple. Actually, our create campaign button, we will add a run script option and we can say theme.set mode. And here we'll just name the mode and we'll say light, or I'll identify the mode by name. So now if we click this button, we'll switch to light mode. And you could, of course, sort of extend this example and be switching modes programmatically from any JavaScript query. So that's how I would get into that. A question here about if this design at this stage is ready to be delivered or handed to someone who's going to be making it a functional app and connected to a database, or are there more steps here? That is a good question. I think the short answer is it's probably a pretty darn good starting point for somebody. It depends on if that somebody has a lot of context with the sort of problem, with the mockup perhaps, with sort of what the functionality should look like. So here's one area where that might not be true. Perhaps it's not obvious to someone with less familiarity with the problem we're solving here, with the tool we're building, that by clicking on one of these rows, we want to navigate to this detail page. So as a designer, as somebody sort of sketching out this application, you could take the responsibility to do that as well. And we would do that by adding an event handler to this table. And I think these event handlers, they're kind of on the cusp of like how much we should really be worrying about a lot of the more technical aspects of Retool when we're just here to be designing. But they're actually sort of similar to like when you're in Figma and you're prototyping and you're building a prototype. So functionally, they can give us some nice functionality, I guess, when we're building a prototype-like Retool app. But what we would do is we'd say when we click row, for example, we want to navigate to a page and we'll navigate to our detail page. So this is something else. And we could do the same thing up in our image component or our logo at the header. We can say when we click this thing, we want to go to our home page, which is pretty standard behavior, right? And so now we've built this out further. We've sort of built out the flow of this thing. So now it's even maybe in better shape to hand off to somebody, but there's really no, I think, sort of hard line. It kind of depends a lot on the context. But in general, something in this shape, I'd feel pretty good about handing off. And then that person would go in, they would write the queries to pull in this data. They would swap out our hard-coded values here for probably references to the queries that they wrote. So this would be dynamic and not hard-coded. And this would be in pretty good shape. Okay, let's do one more question. And it's the question about converting single-page apps to multi-page apps. Yeah, super good question, because the situation everybody's in is you got a bunch of single-page apps. You want to start using multi-page, but you don't want to rebuild everything within a multi-page app. So the short answer is yes, you can do that in two ways. One, if we're inside of an existing multi-page app, when we go to add a new page, we can import a page that already exists as like a multi-page app. So I don't really have many other apps in this instance, but all of your apps would show up here. You could import an existing app as a page. And then I think there's one other example, which is if I just create a non-multi-page app, we can go to this app and we can say duplicate to multi-page. So take an existing single page app, duplicate it as a multi-page app. You could then go ahead and add your additional pages from there. Okay, that is, I think, time. Thank you so much for coming and for the great questions, for the engagement. Let me stop sharing the screen. As I said, my email is kent@retool.com. I'm really happy to chat about anything related to design, so feel free to reach out if you have anything. And I think with that, we will say goodbye. Thanks for your time.